This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In the debate over how to best boost student achievement, especially among kids from low-income families, out-of-school factors are often cited as hurdles that even the best in-school programs and services can't fully overcome. But what about programs that focus on lifting an entire family out of poverty? That's the question today's guest set out to answer. He's Matt Barnum, a national education reporter for Chalkbeat. Matt, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Emily. Longtime listener, first-time caller, so excited to be here.
Well, we're delighted to hear that. Thank you. You write regularly about education research. It's sort of your de facto beat. Why did you want to dig into this one particular question?
Part of it was that I had seen a lot of studies on this issue over the years, and this had been something that I sort of knew as a fact, that there was evidence that anti-poverty programs or greater income for low-income families boosted student achievement and success in school. But I'd never sort of seen it documented or never really set out to find the breadth of studies on this question. And then a new study came across my desk on the earned income tax credit, and like a lot of research, it found that greater access to this program, which targets low-income families, increased high school graduation and college enrollment and completion. And so I'm like, now is a good time to use this study for a broader jumping off point to look at the literature.
So there's no shortage of studies that you could have included in your review, but obviously you needed to narrow it down. What were your parameters for doing that?
There's been studies over many decades, but my focus was on studies from the last decade, the last 10 years in the United States on anti-poverty programs or other increases to family income and how it affected academic outcomes. So that narrowed it down. Other studies had looked at how they affected other outcomes like health. Some studies were older, some studies looked beyond the US. So I narrowed it down with those criteria, and that left me with about 25 studies that I could find.
And just to sum it up briefly, what did you find out?
The pretty consistent evidence, with only a couple exceptions, was that anti-poverty programs or some increase in family income, and anti-poverty programs could include tax credits, they could include food stamps, they could include Medicaid, led to higher student achievement in terms of test scores and led to greater school attainment, which means high school graduation, college attendance, or college completion. That was pretty consistent across programs, whether that was greater income, whether that was through food stamp programs or Medicaid. The one exception was there wasn't particularly clear or compelling evidence that housing programs like public housing or housing vouchers did help students in schools.
And certainly for folks who have spent time in schools with large numbers of kids in need, some of this will feel like common sense. A lot of teachers will tell you, when a child is hungry, it can be more difficult for them to concentrate on their work. But it was really interesting to see you lay it out by these categories. I was a little surprised that there wasn't stronger evidence on the housing front. Did that surprise you?
It did in a way. Even though I had known about this research for a while, the strength of the evidence on academic achievement in terms of test scores was a little surprising to me, because a test score is a sort of end of year look back at how students are doing. So I might have thought that, well, these programs may be helpful to kids, but it might not show up on an end of year test, or the negative effects of poverty might be temporary, or it just might not clearly show up. But the consistency of that evidence was really striking. The housing stuff was surprising, at least in terms of it just not lining up with the rest of the evidence, and it's not totally clear why. There have only been a handful of studies on it, and there is some evidence that the housing programs are helpful for African American kids. But I think that's a puzzle, and I would love for researchers to sort of dig into that more and understand why.
You point to some of the limitations of these findings, including that even in the studies where there were measurable gains, those gains weren't necessarily, from a statistical standpoint, huge. They were comparable, you found, to maybe having a much better teacher in terms of teacher quality, or maybe a much smaller class size. Talk a little bit more about some of these other caveats that you point to in your reporting.
I could go on and on about the caveats. My editor thankfully cut me off. But I do think that the caveats are the least interesting. There's the sort of eat your spinach part of this, but I think they are really important. I would say the biggest caveat is The studies I looked at were fairly recent, but a lot of the studies were looking at older programs. Especially, there were a lot of, for whatever reason, studies focusing on programs or changes in programs in the 90s. And then there were some that were even further back. There were a couple more recent ones, but in general, I would say a gap in the literature is on very recent evidence on this question. I think another limitation is a question of cost effectiveness. We don't have a great sense, I don't think, on what is the best use of a dollar in terms of increasing student achievement in school. Should we spend that on schools? Should we spend that on out-of-school factors? And that wasn't something I dug into very closely, or I think the studies generally dug into. And then I think this is not really a limit with the study, but just a limit of how we think about this issue. The effects of anti-poverty programs on student academic outcomes is just one factor of these programs. And I think many people would argue that it's just inherently valuable and important to make sure poor kids don't go hungry or poor kids have a roof over their heads. So I don't think this is even necessarily the main goal of these programs, or these programs should turn on the academic evidence. But because I'm an education reporter, that's what I focused on.
Well, it's a great reminder to reporters to do this follow-up. When your school district or your state or your county shows up in one of these studies, check in with them and say, hey, is this still going? And what changes have you noticed? I mean, I can remember following up with a couple of districts that were part of a study on student motivation, and they said, we don't do that anymore. The program had literally just been discontinued, and no one could really give me a reason why.
I found this before, where you'll write about something, oh, this works, and then it's like, oh, it's gone now. I mean, there are certainly discussions underway about whether we should roll back some social safety net programs, and this is a very live debate that regularly exists. And so connecting it with the current political moment in Washington or in state capitals, I think, is really important.
Wait, do you know what that sound is? That's right. Starting this week, we are now offering the EWA reading list. Reading for reporters and other listeners who want to find out more about this week's topic. If you want to know more about this sort of cyclical experience that goes on with school issues and school reform, read Tinkering Toward Utopia, A Century of Public School Reform by David Tyack and Larry Cuban. That's my EWA reading list recommendation.
Great. You should make reporters do a book report or some homework on that. So,
Matt, you've just been assigned. We're talking with Matt Barnum of Chalkbeat about his reporting on educational research on the effects of out-of-school programs to lift families out of poverty. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the American Federation of Teachers. AFT was founded in 1916 and today represents 1.7 million members in education, health, and public service. Visit aft.org for more information. EWA retains our editorial control over programming and content. Among the experts you spoke with in your piece was Greg Duncan, a professor and researcher at the University of California, Irvine. He talked about the disconnect between these studies and what education policymakers are focusing on. I thought that was a really essential point in your reporting.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think in some degree, it's really understandable. Anti-poverty programs are not a school reform. They're a policy that helps students do better in school, but they don't directly change how schools are run or how schools function. So I think in one sense, it's really understandable that people who are interested in schools aren't paying attention to this as much. But on the other hand, the fact that we're seeing this consistent evidence that these programs or other efforts to increase family income are helping students at schools suggests that people who are interested in how kids do in school should pay more attention. The other thing that really struck me from like a wonky research perspective was these studies that I was looking at were not appearing in education research journals. In fact, I don't think any of them appeared in education research journals. Almost all of them appeared in economics journals or psychology journals or medical journals. And so I think that may be one reason that people in the education world, including reporters, have paid less attention to this research.
We want to emphasize that in your review of the studies, there's nothing that suggests that teachers aren't a factor here, and there's nothing to suggest that kids in poverty are unable to achieve.
I think that's such an important point. There is a large body of research that shows schools matter, teachers matter for student achievement, including for low-income students in particular. There's evidence that when low-income students or any students have better teachers, they do better in terms of test scores, they do better in terms of going to and staying in college. So the last thing that I would want anyone to take away from this research is that schools don't matter. They do.
There's a heartbreaking detail in your piece that I was not expecting, and I'm going to quote from it. You said students also scored lower on exams near the end of a food stamps benefits cycle, perhaps because their family is running short of food. So the reporter in me says, of course, that's only logical. And then the person in me just got really, really angry.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very normal reaction. And the fact that this can be documented by empirical evidence, I think is really important, even though the results are maybe not entirely surprising. And it's something that I think is really fertile ground for other reporters to dig into. I look at this from a very research empirical driven perspective, and sometimes I do worry that sort of misses the human stories behind it. And I think one way to extend on this work is to talk to more people who are affected by these programs and affected by poverty, and talk to kids and understand how that shapes their schooling experience as well.
I want to talk about research because, as we said, this is your beat. Let's say I'm an education reporter and my editors just handed me a study that looks at student achievement, particularly for kids living in poverty. What advice do you have for them? How are they going to know whether or not this is good research?
Well, that's a big question, and it's a little hard to answer in the abstract. Let me answer that in terms of this specific topic. If an editor dropped a report in front of me that said, a new study shows that low-income students score less well than higher-income students. Well, I would be wondering, is this just showing a correlation between the two things, which has been shown for decades on just tests that you don't even need a study to show that? We see this disparity in performance between low-income students and their higher-income peers? Or is this study, like the studies I reviewed in my piece, really looking at cause and effect? Is it looking at what happens when low-income families get access to more benefits or their incomes increase for one reason or another? And so that is a really important distinction, and that distinction can sort of be hidden. In general, the point about trying to figure out if something is causal or correlational is really crucial in education research, and I think that's the first thing to try to figure out. Causal studies, or studies that attempt to be causal, are really trying to look at changes and how they affect students or families. So, for example, in some of the studies I reviewed, they looked at what happened to families once the earned income tax credit became more generous. And they compared families before it became more generous to after it became more generous, rather than just saying, oh, family that took the earned income tax credit versus family that didn't. What's the correlation? And that, I think, is actually the very first step. And it's not a very straightforward one. Researchers will disagree on the methods and how causal something is. That's the first step, but it's tricky, though.
What about a couple of story ideas for reporters who may be looking at this research and thinking about looking more closely at the relationship between out-of-school programs and students in poverty?
So I think one I just spoke about, trying to follow families, follow students in poverty, look at how that is shaping their lives both in school and out of school and how the two relate with each other. Look at what programs they're tapping into and the benefits of these programs, but also the limits of these programs. And this was something I didn't even get to in my piece in talking to some families who took advantage of such anti-poverty programs. Although the two people I spoke to were very thankful and appreciative of these programs, they also had some concerns about how these programs were administered, how they were implemented, and had thoughts on how they could be done better. And that was something that just didn't quite fit into my piece, but I think would be a rich area to explore. The other thing I would look into is looking from the school's perspective and what schools are doing and wrestling with some of the big and challenging questions here. If I'm a school leader or teacher reading my review of studies, I might say, wow, this is really interesting, this is great. But as a teacher, as a school leader, this is out of my hands. I have to take students as they are. I don't control their earned income tax credit or how food stamps are administered or their generosity. So what do I do to take students and work with my students as they are, even while acknowledging that out-of-school factors are an issue? This is rich territory that has been explored for many years and by smarter, better writers than I, but I think there's work to continue to be looked at here, particularly from the school, parent, and student level.
Matt Barnum is a national education reporter for Chalkbeat. He joined us from his office in New York City. Matt, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Emily.
And thank you, everybody. That wraps up another episode for us. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.